And then I mentioned to you that already once that it's the first Sunday of Advent. And so what we'll be doing over the next several weeks is we're going to be walking through the arrival of Jesus and what that means for us. And so I've been thinking about this, and in particular thinking about Matthew chapter 1. And when I said Matthew chapter 1, you opened your Bible and you're like, oh, if we're probably going to be talking about the birth of Jesus, we can skip all these names. We're probably going to start in verse 18. Because we don't really care about genealogies. In fact, I think the only time that we think about genealogies is when we think about things like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. And so I was even thinking about, like, when did that become popular? Like, I was at lunch with somebody recently, and we were talking about something. I don't even know how it came up, but they're like, hey, have you ever done 23andMe? And I was like, no, I've not. But, like, you realize, like, this is the only time in the history of the world that conversation could happen. Like, nobody in 1880 was like, hey, let's do the Oregon Trail. And have you done your 23andMe? Like, that's never happened before. So this is this unique thing. So I just started doing research this week, trying to figure out when did these genetic genealogies become a thing? And a lot of what I read was, well, as the technology got better and it got cheaper, it made it more available to people. And so it became a consumer type deal. And so more people got into it, but then nobody didn't really give me a time. And so here's my theory. I think that it probably happened sometime in between the end of November and the start of December a few years ago, when somebody had just got done sitting at a Thanksgiving meal next to an uncle that they're like, we can't possibly be related. I can't prove that theory, but I think that's how it happened. Because I think people only care about their backgrounds for one of two reasons, either to prove they're connected to somebody or disprove they're connected to somebody. And so sometimes you do 23andMe or you do Ancestry.com because you're hoping to find somebody famous in your background that you can say, I'm connected to that person. Or there's the opposite. You do your 23andMe, and there are certain names that if they pop up in your family registry, you're like, we don't tell nobody that. Right? Like, nobody is like taking a picture of their results and posting it on their social media feed. I'm related to Adolf Hitler. Like, nobody's doing that. Because there's certain people that you want to distance yourself from, even if you are related to them. So why am I bringing all of that up? Because Matthew uniquely starts his historical story of the life of Jesus with this list of people. And why would you do that? We don't care about that. Like, we live in an attention economy. And like, the minute I lose your attention, I lose anything else that I can possibly get from you. And so why would I waste my time with a list of names that don't feel like they have anything to do with you? So of course we're going to skip that and we're going to jump into the life of Jesus, correct? Here's our main idea. The arrival of Jesus reminds us that God has not forgotten his people or his purposes. Let me pray and we'll jump in. So Lord, as we move into this Advent season, Advent just means the arrival of something. And so as we think about your first arrival in the world and the hope that brings, the joy that it brings, the love that it brings, the peace that it brings, Lord, I pray that as we walk through Matthew's unpacking of the story of your arrival, that it wouldn't just be a tradition that we're hearing about, but it would be life and hope for us this morning. It's in your matchless name, I pray. Amen. Matthew chapter 1, starting in verse 1. An account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, as I read that just kind of feels like it's just kind of filler, just like a heading, like, okay, you're just going to tell me what we're doing. Like, you guys are like, oh, we're really doing this. You're going to do this list of names. I am. This idea of the account of the genealogy of Jesus is actually debated. It's debated for a few reasons because it can be translated a few ways, and the way that it's translated actually determines how much of the book of Matthew that you think that you're talking about. So one version of the translation is the account of the genealogy, like our text says, and it literally just means verses 1 through 17. This family listing of who is connected to who. And so that is one very direct translation. Another way to translate that small phrase is to read it as the record of origins. And so that idea is to say, it's like an origin story in your favorite superhero film. It's this idea of telling the background of where somebody came from. And so if you were reading Matthew chapter 1 all the way through the end of chapter 2, you're actually beginning to see the build out of here's how Jesus came to be. And so it could be the record of Jesus' origin. But actually, maybe the most direct translation of that small phrase is not the account of a genealogy. It's not the record of origins. It's actually the book of Genesis of Jesus Christ. Now, some of you are like, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? Well, like, what are you saying with that? And it's this idea of this book of new beginnings. And some would say that when Matthew uses that small phrase, he's not just talking about the first 17 verses of a family tree, and he's not just talking about the first 2 chapters of Jesus' birth narrative, but he's actually talking about the entire book of Matthew, that when you read this idea of this new book of Genesis that's being written in Jesus Christ, that it's this idea of this new story is being formed when Jesus shows up. And so this idea of this new story that Jesus invites us and brings us into and dawns into our world is actually a really important idea, and it actually fleshes out the rest of what he says. And so then he says that it's not just this family tree, not just these opening chapters, but this new story of how the world is going to work through Jesus Christ. And you need to know that Christ is not his last name. Christ is actually a description that means the word that we sang even in a song just a moment ago, Jesus the Messiah. Messiah means this anointed one of God that was meant to take the kingdom of God and make it real and realize the hope of God's people. That this idea that this is a story of the new beginning that's coming through Jesus Christ, the anointed one of God. And for him to be that person, he had to be the son of David. The son of David. David was the greatest king in the history of Israel, and he was promised that he would always have a son on the throne. And so for Jesus to be that kind of hoped-for king, he had to be part of David's family. And then the next step was not only was he part of David's family, but now he's part of this larger family, the family of Abraham. And so it says that he's the son of Abraham, or this true Israelite. But you know what's really interesting? If I were Matthew, and I were trying to prove to you that God became flesh and dwelt among us, I would do what Luke did in his genealogy, because Luke takes his genealogy all the way back to being the Son of God. And so it's interesting that Matthew stops with humans as if to make it very clear to us that God became like us. And so even in this opening header, that we're getting to read this story of the new beginnings that comes through Jesus, the anointed one of God who sits on the throne of David and is part of the people of God from its very essence, and he is like us. So I wrote it this way. Matthew's introduction is not an uninspired list of names. He's calling our attention to the birth of Jesus as the new beginning that fulfills God's promises. And so as we read these names, Matthew's not arranging these exhaustively. He's arranging them theologically because he wants to prove some points to us. And so he's actually given us the scope of where he's going to go. He's going to start with Abraham and get from Abraham to David. And he's going to get from David, and he'll actually stop in the exile and then go from the exile all the way to Jesus. And he's taking us on an intentional journey to prove what Jesus is fulfilling. So Matthew chapter 1, starting in verse 2, would say this. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Aram. Aram fathered Aminadab. Aminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. It may be salmon. I don't know. If he was a fish, it would be salmon, but since he's a human, I'm going to call him Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered King David. Now, here's what's interesting. As you read this list, if you have maybe a little bit of background in the Bible, some of these names jump out at you. We already talked a little bit about the significance of Abraham. Abraham was the kind of the head of this family that God was building out. And in fact, before Abram even had children, God comes to him and says, hey, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you this covenant, this promise of children that I'm going to give you. You're going to have so many descendants, it's going to be like the stars in the sky. So many descendants, it's going to be like sand on the seashore. I am going to make a people out of you. And then we begin to see that coming to pass. Isaac is the very direct fulfillment of that promise. Isaac has a son, Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons. And among those 12 sons, it's actually pretty interesting that Judah is the one that's brought up. Because if you know anything about the story, Judah's not the hero, at least not early on. Joseph's the hero. Joseph's the one that endures his brothers selling him into slavery. Joseph is the one that endures being lied about by his boss's wife and getting thrown in jail. Joseph is the one who interprets the dreams of a cupbearer and a guy that carries the bread basket and gets forgotten about while he's in jail for 3 years. Joseph's the one that's bold enough to interpret dreams again and give Pharaoh a direction for how to save the nation from drought. Joseph's the one that gets exalted to being second in command. Joseph is the one that has the opportunity at the end of the book to say the key line that what you intended for evil, God intended for good, and forgives his brothers. Like, Joseph is kind of man. Judah, not so much. Judah's kind of sketchy. Judah is the family member that you might sit next to them during Thanksgiving dinner, but you ain't leaving your purse out. Because Judah was the brother that when they're like, hey, we should kill him, he's like, nah, guys, let's not kill him. Let's sell him into slavery and then lie about it. Now, it's not as bad as it could be, but it's pretty close. Judah, it talks about his children, Perez and Zerah, and Perez and Zerah are actually not his only sons. They're not even his oldest sons. They're actually not even the sons that he had with his wife. They're actually sons that he had with his daughter-in-law. I don't even have to explain that to you, and you already know that it's sketchy. Some of you are like, that sounds like the plot line to a Medea movie, right? Like, it is awkward. And so, but I'm going to explain some of it to you because it actually brings some light to why would you pick this dubious character? Well, part of it is because they're trying to go through the tribe of Judah to get to Jesus because that's his family line. But even thinking about the reality of this guy is not a high character individual, at least early in his story. In fact, it goes so far to say that Perez and Zerah, their mother is Tamar. And it actually points to one of 3 women that are in this initial list that are named and something unique about them. So here's the story. In that day and age, when somebody was married, that if their husband passed away, the society was built around the brothers of the husband marrying that woman, taking her in as part of their family. And so Judah's oldest son was married to Tamar. He dies, and the next brother shows up, marries her. He dies, and so now there is a younger son, and he's not old enough to be married. And so Judah makes this promise: when he gets old enough, I'll send him to you so that way he can be your husband. And then he doesn't do what he promises. And then his wife dies, and so now he's both dealing with the death of his wife and dealing with his own desire, and so he decides he's going to go have a night on the town, goes into another country, and he goes to another country, and he finds this woman that he thinks is just a sex worker and decides that he is going to sleep with her. And he does so, and she's like, well, how do I know that you're coming back? And he's like, well, I'll give you my staff, and then he goes on about his life. Come to find out that she's pregnant. At the same time, his daughter-in-law, Tamar, the news comes that she's pregnant, and he was like, I need to find the person that did this. And so she sends him his staff and says, well, the person that did this, the staff belongs to them. And he's like, oh, all right, we good. Scandalous. But beyond the scandal, Tamar isn't part of the people of God. She's not part of the family of Abraham. She's not part of those that they would call Israel. So that's interesting that this scandalous situation will be put in the story, particularly Judah and Tamar being put in the story. Then we keep going, and then I mentioned that there are 3 women that are named. Here's the second woman that's named. It's a woman named Rahab. If you're familiar of the story, after it passes the generation of all of Jacob's sons, they become a nation inside of Egypt. That's how they are saved from a famine, and they begin to grow, and Pharaoh wants to destroy them. And so because of the Pharaoh's insecurity about them, God raises up Moses to deliver them. When Moses actually gets them delivered and out, they're supposed to go into this promised land. And they wander for 40 years because they struggle to believe that God is going to do what he's going to say that he's going to do. And here's where that happened. Because they sent spies into the land to see the land before they went into it. And when they sent those spies, they had to hide at one point, and they end up hiding in a woman named Rahab's house. Now again, Rahab probably isn't the person that you would put very high on your family list because she too has a dubious past. But she's also not part of the people of God. And so now you've got 2 women who have questionable involvement in the story that are not part of the people of God, but yet their names are highlighted in this short list. And then you've got the third woman. It's a woman named Ruth. Ruth is related to a woman, Naomi, and Naomi and her husband and her two sons leave Bethlehem because of a famine, and they go to a place called Moab, which is outside of the people of God, that's full of idol worship, that actually is just an enemy of the people of God. And her two sons get married. Both of her sons die. Her husband dies. And so Naomi's like, I'm going back home. And Ruth's like, I'm going with you. I'll forsake my people. I'll forsake my gods. You will be my people. Your gods will be my God. And she ends up going with her. And so again, we're seeing this name highlighted of this woman who wasn't part of the people of God. It's almost as if Matthew is trying to get you to clue into something, because I mentioned to you that Abraham received a promise, and it was that he was going to have numerous descendants, and also that those numerous descendants were going to be a blessing to the nations. And so now all of a sudden what you're seeing Matthew trying to highlight for you is that this new story that's being written by Jesus Christ, the anointed one of God, is fulfilling the promise of God to Abraham that you're going to have descendants, and these descendants are going to be a blessing to the nations. And even in the family tree are these people who don't belong, but all of a sudden they've got a seat at the table. In fact, it's kind of scandalous. I'm just saying, if you were trying to prove who you were related to, you ain't including Judah, Tamar. You're not touching that scandal with a 39.5-foot pole. Like, you don't have nothing to do with that. You're probably not bringing up Rahab. You're probably not bringing up Ruth. But this story brings them up because there's this hope for those that would be considered scandalous. I wrote it this way. The story of new beginnings through Jesus has always included scandalous hope for outsiders. And I need you to hear that, because maybe you're sitting here and you feel like that kind of outsider. Maybe you feel like if you knew my story and how I even got to this point, you wouldn't want to have anything to do with me. And here's what Matthew's saying, that this is the new story that Jesus is writing, that there are seats at the table for scandalous people like me and like you. And then we move from the lead up to David to beginning to hear about the story of David and that which follows after him. The second half of verse 6 would say this: David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. Solomon fathered Rehoboam. Rehoboam fathered Abijah. Abijah fathered Asa. Asa fathered Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat fathered Joram. Joram fathered Uzziah. Uzziah fathered Jotham. Jotham fathered Ahaz. Ahaz fathered Hezekiah. Hezekiah fathered Manasseh. Manasseh fathered Amon. Amon fathered Josiah. Josiah fathered Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. And this list is actually all people who were officially kings of Judah. David is by far the greatest king that Judah ever knew, all the way down to Jeconiah, who Matthew already let the cat out of the bag. Jeconiah is the guy who happens to be the king when the exile happens. And what's interesting is as you read through this list, it is this roller coaster of faithfulness and unfaithfulness. If Abraham had a promise, it'd be important to know that David had a promise also. David had a promise that God said to him, hey, you don't need to build a house for me. In fact, I'm not going to let you do that. Your sons are going to do that, but I'm going to build a house for you. And what I'm going to build is that there is this promise that you are always going to have you're going to have a son on the throne. And so what you would expect is, okay, if that's what's going to happen, then we're going to see this picture of people that are modeled after David that are going to keep this faithful line of people going. And if you've spent any time reading about any of the kings of the Old Testament, you're like, that ain't what happens at all. It's even interesting to me because David is the greatest of them, but even the way that David is put in this frame is that David fathered Solomon by Uriah's wife. If you don't know the story, usually if you're talking about whose child you fathered, it doesn't start with somebody else's husband's name in front of it. And so David fathered Solomon through a woman named Bathsheba, who was the wife of a man named Uriah. David was supposed to be at battle, at war. That's where Uriah was at the time. But David decided to stay home. And David, using a power flex as being king and being consumptive and taking whatever he wanted, he saw this woman, wanted her, slept with her, gets her pregnant. And instead of taking accountability, he says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to kill this guy. Even David and all of his following after God's heart had some issues that we probably wouldn't be proud of. And we certainly wouldn't highlight that in our family tree. It's funny, during the previous service, I was talking about this, and the guy said, hey, my family tree, we got horse thieves. And I was like, I don't know why you told me that. I don't know why you wanted to highlight that. In the same way, I don't know, you don't want to highlight that you got somebody else's wife pregnant and killed them. But somehow, Matthew thinks that's pertinent information. Because what it's beginning to build for us is, regardless of how good we think the human king is, there's going to be something in them that doesn't satisfy sitting on the throne. And so what we'd expect is that you'd go from David, and then it would just keep getting, it would either stay the same or keep getting better. And so now you move into Solomon, and Solomon is great. He builds a house for the Lord, and then at the end of his life, we're questioning his faithfulness to the Lord because he's been entangled with the customs of his foreign wives, and we're not sure how faithful he was to the Lord in the end. And then we move to his son Rehoboam, who has all the vices of his daddy Solomon. And then in addition to that, he was greedy. And so he starts taxing the people so much that the nation splits into two nations. 10 tribes go north and say, we don't have anything to do with you. We are 2 generations in, and we got a problem. And it doesn't get better for very long from here. His son Abijah is evil because he didn't have a heart fully devoted to the Lord. Asa removes the altars and brings the nation back to worship. I'm like, well, maybe we're moving back in the right direction. But Asa's son, Jehoshaphat, continues this pattern of faithfulness. But then he creates an alliance with Ahab and Jezebel in the northern kingdom. You don't have to know nothing about the Bible. But you know that if somebody's named Jezebel, you'd be like, she can't be trusted. And so Ahab and Jezebel were evil king and queen in the north. And in fact, there are no good kings in the northern kingdom. And yet Jehoshaphat, though he was faithful to God, makes the foolish mistake of building an alliance with them. And here's how deep the alliance goes, that he takes his son and he lets his son marry their daughter so that way that they can be united in an alliance. And here's what happens. His son Joram kills his brothers to consolidate his power and leads the nation back into worshiping idols. Uzziah was actually not the son of Joram. There's actually 3 kings in between them, but all 3 of those kings are increasingly evil. And it's almost as if Matthew's like, hey, evil has already been represented. Let me turn the ship a little bit. And Uzziah is awesome. If you've actually ever heard me preach about Uzziah, you know where this is going. Uzziah is a great leader, a great military leader. He's inventive and creative. And at the end of his life, he dies by himself in leprosy because of his anger, his arrogance and his pride. Seems like even the best kings have issues. Jotham was a faithful servant, but his service was incomplete because he didn't remove the altars. Ahaz ignored the prophets, particularly Isaiah, and then in addition to that, he makes the nation a servant under Assyria. And this is the last time that Judah will ever have been a free nation because now they're under somebody else's reign. From there, Hezekiah was a great king, but even he makes the foolish mistake of making an alliance with Babylon, and it's so detrimental to them that he has to take the gold off the post and the gates and sell them to pay a debt to Assyria because of the pact that he made. Manasseh is described as one of the most wicked kings in the history of Israel. Ammon returns the nation to idol worship. Josiah becomes king at 8 years old and reforms the nation to worshiping the Lord and brings back the Passover celebration. And it's like, man, finally we're getting there, only to stumble in a few generations later to Jeconiah, who drops the ball so much that now they're giving over to Babylonian captivity. These kings ain't getting it done. These kings, even the best of them, seem to have these areas of failure in them. And as you read through that list and read those names, it should make you long for, is there anybody that can show up and be the actual faithful son that God promised to David? The faithfulness of the generations following David is inconsistent at best. The arrival of Jesus promises a king who will not fail. And then the final section. Verse 12 says, after the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah fathered Shealtiel. Shealtiel fathered Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel fathered Abiud. Abiud fathered Eliakim. Eliakim fathered Azor. Azor fathered Zadok. Zadok fathered Achim. Achim fathered Eliud. Eliud fathered Eleazar. Eleazar fathered Mathan. Mathan fathered Jacob. And Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, who gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David until the exile to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the exile to Babylon until the Messiah, 14 generations. One of the things that might jump out at you in this list is the names Shealtiel and Zerubbabel. If you've been around with us this year, in particular while we were going through our Ruins and Renewal series, you saw the name of Zerubbabel come up, and it was always Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel. Outside of that, you probably don't care a lot about the names on this list because you ain't heard of the names on this list. In fact, Zerubbabel is unique because Zerubbabel came back as a leader amongst the exiles, and he was the governor. But what was surprising about him was though he was part of the family of David, he wasn't a king, he was a governor. He was kind of the guy, but not really the guy. Kind of had the position, but didn't really have the authority. Kind of was the leader, but he was also under Persia. Like he was sort of the thing, but he wasn't fully the thing. He was playing a role, but he didn't have the power. Like Zerubbabel was important, but he wasn't ultimate. And then after him, the names that are listed are not found anywhere else in the Old Testament. All the names that are in the Abraham section are found in Ruth listed as a genealogy. All the names that are in the David section are in 1 Chronicles 3 listed as a genealogy. But these names, Matthew got them from somewhere. They're not made up names, but they certainly aren't people of note. We don't know anything about them except for this one thing. None of them was good enough to get the throne. That even at the time that Matthew is writing, that there's a puppet king named Herod who is not able to be fully what God said was going to be on the throne because he's not part of the family of David. He's been put there by Rome, and he's really not good for much of anything. And so we just keep seeing these imposters in this list that don't match up. They don't fulfill what we expect them to fulfill. And even when you get to Joseph, Joseph is not named the father of Jesus because he's not the father of Jesus. He's named the husband of Mary. And so now you've got this tension that he can't be in the role that he's in. And maybe Matthew is trying to make something very apparent for us. That Jesus is not just making a place for outsiders, that he's not just redeeming failures, but he's also changing the game for people who can't fulfill the role that they're being put in. And so they would have said of Zerubbabel, oh, you governor, but you ain't king. Or they would have said of Joseph, oh, you're called his father, but you ain't that boy's daddy. They may have not said that way in the New Testament, but that's how I felt it, so I said it that way. And somebody might say of you, oh, you're raising your hand in worship, but you ain't that holy. You're playing the role, but you don't have any of the power. Somebody might say of you, you're showing up in small group and you're doing the Christian thing, but you're actually not that changed from what you used to be. And yet somehow Matthew wants to make it abundantly clear that what Jesus is doing is he's writing a new story, not just for the outsider, not just for the failure, but for the person who's in the role and doesn't feel like they have any of the power. That he is making space for people who feel like imposters. While none of the names in the third group arrive at the status we expect, Jesus is all of what God has promised. So what do we do with it? I said it to you before. The arrival of Jesus reminds us that God has not forgotten his people or his promises. Last week, Capenna ended our series on gospel fluency. And he was preaching a message on new creation from Romans 8, and he spent some time talking about this idea of hope. That hope is not this internal motivation of thinking that things are going to be better so you hang on, but it's actually this external reality that comes from understanding what Jesus has accomplished that shapes the way that you see the world. During that, he quoted a man named Michael Bird, and Michael Bird would say it this way: hope is not optimism. Rather, hope is the audacity of faith under adversity. The gospel is the story of the invasion of hope into the world that knows only despair and doubt. I decided, me and Michael Bird had the same first name, so I figured I could steal his words and make them my own. And so I wrote it this way: hope is not optimism. Rather, hope is the audacity of trust in Jesus to write a new beginning to the scandalous stories we wish we could forget. Christmas is the story of God restoring hope for, not just despite, outsiders, failures, and imposters. Like here, what I'm trying to point you to, that if the arrival of Jesus brings hope, here's the hope that it brings, that there is a new story for you. There's a new story for you if you felt like an outsider. There's a new story for you if you felt like a failure. There's a new story for you if you feel like an imposter. And that is because of the story of Jesus. Preaching is a uniquely difficult thing. Sometimes it's really easy because you just feel the text down in your toes. Like a few weeks ago, I preached out of 2 Samuel, the story of Mephibosheth. Man, I could have 173-degree fever and I would still preach the mess out of that text. Because I just love that text and I feel that text. There are other times where I'm preaching stuff and I'm just emotionally and experientially distant from it and I want to be faithful to God's word, but I don't have the same level of connection to that. But you be faithful and you do what you can do and you believe that the Lord's using that to reach somebody. But that's not the hardest time to preach the text. The hardest time to preach the text is when you're really emotionally close to it, but you don't want to deal with that. And so this week I'm preparing for this, and the way I titled the message was Hope for the Forgotten. And honestly, as I was like, okay, Lord, what do you have for your people in this genealogy? And the more I studied, and the more I read, and the more I dealt with it, the more I'm like, Lord, you're not talking to them, you're talking to me. The more I felt this internal dynamic of saying, oh, Lord, I felt that sense of being on the outside, not being able to find my way in. I don't want to talk about that with them. I've been in a season where there have been different moments where I've just sat at my desk and I actually have a table. That's my desk in my office. So I sat at my table and I feeling the weight of failure. And I'm like, Lord, if they knew how often I felt exhausted and wanted to quit, if they knew how often I don't have the faith that I think I'm supposed to have, if they knew how often I felt like, if they knew all the jacked up stuff in me and all the sin and all the mistakes and all the foolishness, if they knew all of that, they would not trust me to put on the face mic. Like, I don't want to stand up and talk about hope for the forgotten because I have to live that out, and I don't know that I feel that right now. So I just want to invite you on a journey over the next several weeks. If you feel like you're on the outside of looking in, Jesus has hope for you. If you feel like you've screwed up too many times, that nobody's putting your name on any type of 23andMe list and celebrating it, that nobody's leaving their purse around you at Thanksgiving dinner, like if you fail like that, Jesus has hope for you. If you feel like an imposter, maybe even right now you feel itchy in your skin because you're like, if they found out what was really going on in me, they wouldn't want to be near me. They wouldn't trust me. They wouldn't look at me like they do right now. They wouldn't come near to me like Jesus has hope for you in this season. And not just because we're going to well up internal motivation, but because Jesus arriving, and as the way that Matthew structures this genealogy, writing this new story by becoming near us and making us part of the family, like that's being made available for you and for me. And I know sometimes we get this thing in our head, that, man, but we don't even play that much of a significant part in the story. Church that I worked at when I was in Dallas, one of the elders had a daughter who lived in the Atlanta area that was an aspiring actor. And she calls her dad and she's like, Dad, I got a role. It's going to be awesome. He's like, what are you in? She's like, I'm in The Walking Dead. And he's like, that's awesome. So he flies to Atlanta to go spend time with her. And he's like, okay, tell me more about it. Tell me what you're doing. He's like, what's your role? She's like, I'm a zombie. He's like, what do you mean? She's like I'm an extra in the background. You want to see my zombie walk? And so she shows him the zombie walk. And I've never met this young lady. The only reason, the fact that I know this story is because her dad told me the story. I'm sitting there at his house having dinner. We're getting ready to watch The Walking Dead because he loves the show because his daughter is in it for maybe a millisecond. In some far off scene, out of focus, limping in the background as a zombie. It is a terribly small part in the show. But not to her daddy. To her dad, she might as well be the title character of the show. Because regardless of how small her part is in the story, she's still in the story and he sees her in it. Can I just tell you that this morning you may feel that your role as an outsider or your role as a failure, or your role as an imposter is a terribly unimportant small part in the story, that in fact, if God removed it, it really wouldn't change anything. And yet what the Father sees is that you are intimately involved, and that not despite you, but for you, he's providing hope in the midst of this story. Don't despise where you are. He sees you, and it is providing hope for it. The book of Genesis through Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, is a story of new hope that's being provided for you. Let's pray together. So Jesus, I pray for people in this room who feel ignorable, forgettable, regrettable because of their mistakes, that you would remind them that your arrival means that you have not forgotten your promises, but even greater than that, you have not forgotten your people. That wherever we might fall on that list, maybe because we feel like we've gotten a late start in following you, we feel like an outsider that doesn't belong. Maybe because of the number of failures, we feel like there's nothing redeemable about us. Or maybe because our world causes us to posture and perform, we feel like we're this imposter that really isn't truly who you've called us to be. But Lord, I pray that when we behold you, we talked about that earlier, that we would see ourselves rightly because we see you fully. So help us to see the new story that you're writing, a story of hope. Over the next several weeks, we'll not talk about just hope, but joy and peace and love that you want to provide because you have entered into our story and you've invited us into yours. Would you make that real for us? I don't even know what that looks like. But Lord, would you make it tangible and real that we would know that you have not forgotten us or your promises. So in your matchless name I pray. Amen. Thanks so much for checking out this message from Kings Harbor. We would love to connect with you. If you go to kingsharbor.org/hello and fill out a short connect card, that allows us the opportunity to follow up with you. Also, if this message has been a blessing to your life, we believe that the Lord wants to rule and reign in every part of who we are. That means our time, our talent, our treasure. And so if this has been a blessing, we would ask that you would consider contributing back to the ministries of Kings Harbor so we can continue to bless and help people in the same way that we hope we have done for you. With that in mind, we want you to know that our heart towards you and our heart towards the world around us is that we want to be a love-forward people. And we're praying that you would join us in that.